Hello, my name is Dr. Tracy Revels. I am a professor of history here at Wofford College, and I gave this talk on March 21st for Women's History Month. Unfortunately, we had a technical issue and the talk did not get recorded. So we are recording it again because we promised some students and friends of the college we would, and so we hope you'll get a chance to watch it and enjoy it. I'd like to today introduce you to the most interesting woman you haven't met yet. Her name is Ellen Call Long, and she lived a very complicated life, a life in which she did many interesting things, and a life that reflects a lot of things that happened in the 19th century, in the American South, and also reflects some of our big ideas about women's history. So let's get started. We'll start, because it's a complicated life, I'm going to break it down like a movie or a play or a book would. I'm going to break it into acts and also into roles, because one of the interesting things about Ellen Call Long is how many roles she played in her lifetime. She is a daughter first, of course, and she is born in Tallahassee, Florida in 1825. It's worth getting to know her parents a little bit. Her father was Richard Keefe Call. Now that name is a very big name in the early history of the state of Florida. Richard Keefe Call was born to a Patriot family in Virginia. He grew up in Kentucky, and when he was a young man, he fell in with a circle of young men who all admired, looked up to, and followed Andrew Jackson. So one of his friends in the circle, for example, was Sam Houston, a name you might have heard in the founding of Texas. These men admired Jackson, and Jackson helped them out a lot with their early careers. While he's in Nashville, Richard Keefe Call meets a young woman named Mary Kirkman. They have a courtship, and they get married in the Hermitage. So Ellen Call Long could literally say her parents married in Andrew Jackson's parlor. I think that's a pretty interesting distinction for early America. The young couple then moved to Florida and settled in Tallahassee. Now, Florida in 1825, when Ellen Call Long is born, is a territory. It's not a state yet. And it is a very wild and woolly place. In fact, it's a lot more like the Wild West than what we would think of as the Old South. It was just a village. There was still a heavy Native American presence there. It could be a very violent place. It was known for having lots of duels in the street. But Ellen's born there in 1825, and her parents have already begun building a beautiful house there called the Grove. And the Grove is going to be important to our story. Her parents hoped that Ellen Call Long would be a boy. They wanted to name her Andrew Jackson Call, but she was a girl, so that didn't work out. And the Calls would go on to have 6 children. But one of the ways in which Ellen's life mirrors a lot of what happened in the 19th century is that she learned that life was very fragile. Even well-off people like her parents, because her father did very well in land speculating and planting and being a politician, even wealthy people didn't get very good medical care. Of the 6 children, only 2 lived to adulthood, Ellen and her sister Mary. Ellen remembered as a young child watching a brother and a sister die on the same day and be buried in the same coffin. A very arresting image that no doubt stuck with her. At age 9, Ellen went off to boarding school in Franklin, Maryland. Now, this is another moment where Ellen's life is a reflection of what's going on for well-to-do women in the early national period. One of the sort of questions of the day was, what is a woman's role in the new nation? What can women do? They can't vote, they can't serve on juries, they can't fight. How does a woman prove her love for her country? And the answer to that you would have found in sermons and newspaper articles and personal letters, was a sense that one should get as good of an education as one could get, and then use that education to raise patriotic children. Have enough history to be able to teach your kids to love George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and understand everything about the Revolution. We call this idea Republican motherhood. And that's what Ellen was basically training for when she went off to a female academy. Now, this is like a high school for girls. She wouldn't have been learning the kind of things you needed to learn to get into Wofford College in 1854. She wouldn't have had any Greek or Latin. But she did have English, composition, French. She studied history, geography, basic mathematics, and even what she called scientific dialogues. But while she is away at this boarding school, she gets really bad news. Her mother has died. Another, again, common thing to happen in the 19th century. So Ellen, when she gets the word from her father, she writes him a letter that is quite touching, in which she says, "I will obey you in all things. I will always do my best to make you happy." It's like she dedicates her whole life to being a great supporter for her father. Well, when Ellen is 17, she comes back home to Tallahassee to become a belle. Now, I know when I say the word belle, students, and I have a student here with me today, probably start singing Tale as Old as Time from Beauty and the Beast. That's what they think of. And a little bit older people tend to think of Scarlett O'Hara, the beautiful woman with a big hoop skirt. But really, all the word belle means is a time in your life. If you're a well-to-do girl and you've finished your education and you're presented into society, belle is a period between when you're presented and when you get married. It's the most exciting time in a young woman's life. She goes to parties and picnics, she goes to dances, she's the center of attention, all the while looking out for who am I going to marry. And when Ellen came back to Tallahassee at age 17, she must have been really excited because she was the First Lady of Florida. Her father was now the territorial governor, so I'm sure she got to go first in every party and dance, and it must have been really exciting. But Ellen was clearly a decisive young woman. It didn't take her long to figure out who she was going to marry. The proposal she accepted came from a young man named Medicus Long. And can we just take a minute to appreciate this name? Medicus. Wow, doesn't it sound deep and wise? Well, there were two warning flags, I think, when the couple married. And they married there at the Grove in 1844. There were two little warning flags. One was the fact that Medicus was more than a decade older than Ellen. Now today, I think we'd be really disturbed if a 18-year-old girl is marrying a 30-year-old man. It's not that uncommon in the 19th century for there to be a bit more of an age difference, but it's still a little off, especially, for her to only be 18. The other red flag, though, was political. For you see, Ellen had become a real political animal, and whatever her father believed in, she believed in. Her father was in the Jacksonian mold. Our federal union, it must be preserved. That's what he believed in, and that's what she believed in too. But Medicus over here, he was more about states' rights, including the right of secession. So immediately we should think, uh-oh, trouble ahead, stormy waters ahead. Well, for 10 years, the couple seemed to be pretty happy. They had 5 children together, and that meant Ellen spent a lot of her time being a mother and a matron, which is just a word for a married woman. They had 5 kids, but again, life is fragile in the 19th century. Only 2 of them, a boy and a girl, survived. And then around 1855, we begin to see our first hints of trouble. Medicus and Richard Keith Call have an open political debate, and they are at opposite sides of the political spectrum. Remember, Ellen promised to always obey her father, but as a good wife, you're supposed to obey your husband. I'm sure there were trouble there. I don't have to tell anyone listening that politics can easily tear a family apart. On top of all of that, Medicus had a lot of health problems. He had a lot of respiratory issues. Tallahassee, Florida is an awful place to be if you have respiratory issues because it's hot and humid and muggy and you're coughing all the time. So in 1859, Medicus Long said, my doctors have told me I need to go somewhere warmer and drier. He's not getting along with his daddy-in-law. And so he leaves and he goes to San Antonio, Texas. And he never comes home. He goes there and he will stay there. He will become a secessionist politician, a Confederate judge. And he dies, I believe, in 1885. Never comes back to see his wife. I wish I knew how Ellen felt about that. I don't know if she cried and was upset, or if she might have been like, whew, he's gone, thank goodness. She was an abandoned wife. And I know students are probably thinking, well, why didn't they just get a divorce? Well, here's the problem. Divorces are really hard to get in the mid-19th century. It requires a special act of the legislature. And Medicus had been in the legislature. But the problem also is that it makes you a social pariah. You're not going to be invited anywhere. You're not going to be welcomed to places. And for a woman, you also lose custody of your children. And both of her children were still relatively young. So we don't really know. But her husband leaves her in 1859, and we don't have any indication that Ellen feels like, I have to sit at home and be sad. Nope, she's got to move forward. And now, the second part of her life is about to begin. You know, if you read books or watch a lot of movies, the second act is where it always goes crazy, right? Things are always happening, there's a lot of drama. Well, there was certainly a lot of drama in her second act, because her second act occurred during the U.S. Civil War. Now, Richard Keith Call was a Unionist, and so was Ellen Call Long. And it's important, I really want people to understand that you could be a Unionist and still own slaves. Being a Unionist in the South didn't mean you were an abolitionist. It didn't even mean you were a great fan of Lincoln. It simply meant secession was wrong, you didn't want to break up the nation, you wanted problems to get worked out another way. Richard Keith Call and his daughter both argued against Florida seceding from the Union, but Florida did secede from the Union. And Ellen would write later about some young men coming up to her father and bragging, well, guess what, Governor, we have seceded from the Union. And according to Ellen, her father raised his cane and swung it around and says, you've done it? Yes, you have done it. You have opened up the gates of hell, from which the curses of the damned shall sink you to perdition. I don't know, that's a little dramatic. Maybe he didn't say it quite that way, but he felt that way. I guarantee you that is how he felt. But Ellen had a teenage son. And that son was eager to run off and join the Confederate Army, and he did. So what's Ellen going to do? Like many women during the Civil War, she had a divided heart. She didn't really believe in the Confederate cause, yet she was a Southerner. She didn't like secession, but everybody around her is seceding. And her son is going off to fight, so of course she wants to do things that are going to help him. Ellen became a really dedicated Confederate fundraiser. She helped to found a ladies' aid society that met in the Capitol building in Tallahassee. She worked to raise money for poor families. She did all the things that you would expect a good Confederate matron to do. But sometimes people noticed that she wasn't so happy. One Confederate officer who passed through and was entertained there at the Grove wrote back to his wife about Ellen, and he said, well, she's a nice old lady, because she wasn't that old, but she's a nice old lady except for occasional bitterness, which tells me that sometimes that mask slipped a little bit for Ellen Call Long. Sometimes she couldn't quite play the role to the hilt. Her father died in September of 1862. This would have been an absolutely devastating moment for Ellen. So now she already owned the Grove. Her father had given that to her, but now she inherits some other properties as well, including 66 enslaved people. So along with all the fundraising, she also now has to manage a very large estate. She has to take care of her young daughter. Her sister has married, started having kids. There's just a lot to do. Ellen is now a matriarch. Everybody is relying, and that family is relying on Ellen. Well, the war ends, as we know, in 1865, and Ellen had predicted this. She was really mad. She hated Jefferson Davis. Oh, she hated those Confederate politicians. Yet at the same time, it broke her heart to see the Southern people brought low. And for her personally, it was going to be a challenge, because now she has a lot of land, but the enslaved people are freed, so she's lost property too, and she doesn't have a lot, like a lot of Southerners, she's land rich and cash poor. She's facing the potential of a future of what I call genteel poverty, meaning you've got a house, you've got a name, but you don't have a lot of resources. The first thing she has to start do is taking in boarders. Imagine that, having to open up your house as a hotel. That's one of the very first things she does. It's very common for a lot of Southern widows to do. So what's going to happen in Act 3? Well, usually in Act 3, things get resolved. But for Ellen, things got more interesting. It's like at this point, she becomes an independent individual. She's not relying on her husband. She's not having to work for Dad's approval. But she takes a lot of ideas, and she's incredibly busy with them. One of the first things Ellen is determined to do is help in national reconciliation. How do we bind up the wounds of the war? How do we get people to work together again? How do we get Southerners to remember they're Americans too, and we should come back together as a nation? That's one of her big concerns. A second big concern is, how do I promote my state? Ellen identified as a Floridian. She was a native of Florida, and she dearly loved her home. And she knew that the days of the Cotton Kingdom might be waning. What were other ways that Florida could succeed? What other products could it offer? How could they get people to come down, move in, invest? That was something Ellen was very interested in. And finally, she was interested in women. How could women step up, help? How can women do these things? How can women promote the state? How can they promote unity? How can they be useful? All of those things she brought together. And the big way that she brought them together was by getting interested in and trying to get other people interested in the many national exhibitions that happened in the half century after the Civil War. You and I would call these world fairs. In 1876, there is the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. In, I want to say 1882, but the early 1880s, there's a cotton exposition in New Orleans, Louisiana. 1889, there's an international exhibition in Paris. And then in the early 1890s, there's the famous Columbian exhibition in Chicago, the great white city. And Ellen takes it upon herself to try to get Florida women to raise money, to create works of art, to send things in that will be displayed at these fairs, to try to get people interested in Florida. Well, that was easier said than done. And you have to remember, this is an age before social media. She can't just click a selfie and send it out to everybody. She's actually got to sit at her desk and write letter after letter after letter, begging women in different towns to have parties and have teas and produce things and send it all in. This could be hard when so many of those women had been ardent Confederates who had decided they were going to hate the Yankees forever. That's what we call being unreconstructed. One woman wrote and said, you know, after so many years of hating people in the North, it will be hard to bury the hatchet. And Ellen essentially told her, I got a shovel. I'm ready to bury that hatchet. And so she just worked and worked and worked. She had to know who to be nice to, who to scold, who to fuss at, who to pressure. This is when somebody called Ellen Call Long a thorough lady, a very thorough lady indeed. She did get Florida represented at the Centennial Exhibition, where one reporter described her as marshaling the troops in Philadelphia. She was sent to the Cotton Exposition as a representative from Florida. There, she struck up a friendship with Julia Ward Howe. You might know that name as a suffragist leader, but also as a woman who wrote the words to Battle Hymn of the Republic, became one of Ellen's friends. She went to Paris. She was sent to represent Florida at Paris, and also managed to get a small exhibition at the White City. So she was moderately successful in these things. But she also had other interests as well. She'd always been interested in science and agriculture, and really wanted to find some sort of product that Floridians could produce. She thought silk might be a good idea. Florida's warm, maybe we could raise silkworms. She converted part of her house into a greenhouse, and in fact, raised enough silkworms and processed enough silk to make a flag. This is not her, by the way, but this is just to show you the kind of size of the flag that she and her granddaughter made. She even wrote a book about silk farming. It never took off, sadly, but you know, she did good work, and people were like, wow, somebody knows something about this in state. She also, interestingly enough, liked forestry. A lot of her property were woods, and she walked around in those great pine forests in Florida. And she wrote, she was the secretary for the National Forestry Association one year, and she wrote a little pamphlet about why fire is necessary to keep pine trees healthy. The pine trees need fire to release seedlings, to have nutrients in the soil. And the scientists all said she was crazy. Well, she didn't have any formal scientific training, but she walked in the woods for a long time, and she'd made observations. And as someone whose own family farm down in Florida is now completely in pine trees, I'm grateful for Ellen's observations. And yes, control burns are now accepted forestry procedure. So she does that, but all of this isn't really making her any personal money. She needs some money because she is very, very poor. So she turns to writing. Now this is again a reflection of women's history. Well-to-do, elite women in the 19th century, if they wanted to make money, if they'd fallen into genteel poverty, one way they could do it and still be seen as quote-unquote respectable was to write for magazines or to write novels. And so Ellen joined with a group of other women in Florida to write a whole lot of articles promoting the state. Many of them were published in magazines that promoted the state, tried to get people to come down to the state. One of Ellen's colleagues in this little group is another name you may have heard of, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She moved to Florida after the Civil War and promoted Florida living. And collectively, this group of about 5 women started a Florida regional literature which portrayed Florida as a particularly great place for women, because you could come to Florida and throw off all those stuffy New England attitudes, that Florida was a female frontier. She edited her father's memoirs and papers, but couldn't find a publisher. She wrote a history of Florida, but couldn't find a publisher. But finally, she did have one bit of luck here with a novel. It's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but it's called Florida Breezes. It's a novel about life in Tallahassee before and after the Civil War. Now, if you ever find a copy of Florida Breezes in an old bookstore, an original copy, buy it, and you can put your children through college, or you can retire very comfortably, because there are very few copies of that book still in existence. Why? Well, Ellen made the people of Tallahassee mad. You see, her story was pretty much as it happened, and she had changed names, but people recognized themselves. So they recognized all the little petty squabbles and people not acting very well, and they knew exactly who she was talking about, and they were absolutely scandalized. And so most of the copies were bought up and burned or destroyed. People did not like this book at all. Now, those are our sort of 3 acts, but I want a little interlude as well, because I'd like to share with you an important story that I hope will tell you something about how historians work, and also maybe the lessons we can take from biography. I got interested in Ellen Call Long when I was a student at Florida State. And I found out that in the Florida State Archives, they had her wartime diary. So I really wanted to read that. But at the time, there was a hold on it. The public could not read it. I had to wait until I had my PhD and I was working at Wofford College and working on my book on women in Florida during the Civil War, until finally the hold went off and anybody could read it. So you can just imagine me running to the archives, gimme, I want to read this diary. So I'm sitting there with my gloves on my hands, reading this diary, and very interesting, taking all kind of notes. But then I got to a passage that was right as the war had ended that was really disturbing. And I'm going to paraphrase what it said. She's talking about the newly freed slaves. And she says that people in the North will always hate people in the South and call them monsters about slavery, because people in the South did things like break up slave families. Something very true, they did that. And then she says, oh, but breaking up slave families wasn't as bad as people thought, because slaves are like eternal children. They like novelty. They like novelty? I'm sorry, that's one of the most shocking and racist things I have ever read. I found it hard to believe one human being could actually believe other human beings just don't mind when you take their husbands and wives and children away from them. It was horrible. And I'm a Southern historian, so I live in a world of horrible. There are lots of horrible things in Southern history. I should not have been shocked, but I was. And I think part of why I was so shocked was I wasn't reading this on a screen. I wasn't reading this in a book somewhere. I was holding the actual paper that the actual woman put the actual pen on in my hands. And I had to put it down and sort of back away and breathe for a little bit, have to have a moment. But I kept going, because that's what historians do. We keep going. The past is never completely a closed book. we have to keep going and exploring and finding out what else can we learn and where did the story go from here. And so I was determined to follow Ellen Call Long's life past the Civil War. There were about 7 women whose lives I was following. So I did that, and I found something really interesting that happened. The bad stuff was in 1865, but then in 1882, Ellen needed money badly, really needed that money. And some political friends told her, look, we can get you a job. We're going to get you appointed to be the postmaster of Tallahassee. That would have been a cushy, well-paying job. And Ellen said no. And they're like, why not? And she said, because there's a black man who holds that job. I know him, Mr. Stewart. He's well qualified. He deserves that job. He doesn't deserve to be kicked out of it because of me. He's earned that job. I haven't. I won't accept it. And this infuriated her friends, and it infuriated many people in Tallahassee. How dare you do that? But she stuck to her guns. She said, no, I'm not going to take this job away from someone who is more qualified. So I'd like to suggest a couple of things. First of all, I don't want to make too much of this. Ellen certainly didn't go out and become a crusader for civil rights. If you read her writing, it's very Moonlight and Magnolias. There's a lot of, romanticizing the Old South. But at this one moment in her life, she did look very different to the private thought she expressed in 1865. I can't quite account for it. I'd like to know more. I'd like to explore and find out more. But I'd also like to suggest if biography, especially biographies of people who aren't the founding fathers, aren't the big famous people, offers us some good lessons. It's a chance to look at decisions that people made, especially if they made a decision that wasn't the easy, comfortable decision, a decision that was the hard but the morally correct decision. And then when we see people making those decisions, then we ask ourselves, what decisions am I making? How could I make a better decision? Because ultimately, isn't that what we hope history teaches us, maybe, is how to think about, to grapple with how can we be better for our fellow human beings. All right, well, I'd like to, whoops, I'm sorry, I did one thing wrong. Let me go back. I did want to point out very quickly that there aren't many pictures of Ellen Call Long. This one is from 1880. I have to point out that she's wearing real flowers on her dress. That seems to be kind of a thing in this time period, to always have a corsage of some type on when you have your picture made. But it's really unfortunate that we don't have a picture of her maybe from the Civil War era. All of our images are her as an older woman. And this one was made in the very last year of her life, in 1905. The last years of her life were pretty sad. Ellen was forced to sell property, which she had vowed not to do, but she had to do it, had to sell off land. She had to sell furniture, oil paintings, the marble fireplaces had to go to make her money. And perhaps the thing that must have broke her heart the most, certainly breaks mine, is that she had a bunch of letters from Andrew Jackson to her father, and she sold them to autograph collectors, and so they've been lost forever. That must have been something that was very hard to part with. But she did it because her family needed her to. Her son had gotten married, come home, had a wife and kids, wasn't doing very well in a career. Her daughter had married and been widowed with children. Ellen's still taking care of a lot of people. But finally, in 1905, she passes. And this is, again, probably the last picture of her. You see she's a very old lady, wrapped up in an afghan. She's in a wheelchair. This is the old-timey style of wheelchair, or rolling chair, as my grandmother would have called it. When Ellen was buried, Her funeral procession included 2 governors of Florida. She had known every governor of Florida since Andrew Jackson. She'd been friendly with all of them. She put being friendly with people who could promote the state ahead of her personal political beliefs. 2 governors, at least 2 cabinet members, were honorary pallbearers at her funeral. An age had passed. This woman is born in early territorial period, lives all the way to the progressive era. That's a lot of time to go through. And you can visit the grove where she lived, her big home. It's right here. It's the Grove Museum. It's in the heart of Tallahassee. It is a museum where you can go in and there's a room about Richard Keefe Call. There's a room about Ellen. The last time I visited, they had this wonderful thing. It was like a big desk that you could just do like this, woo, woo, like you're on Star Trek or something. And all these documents would come up about her life. I thought that was really neat. It also has a room that is dedicated to Leroy Collins, who married into the Call family. He's considered by many people to be Florida's greatest governor. And very importantly, it also interprets African American life in Tallahassee, because we have to remember the Grove was part of a plantation. Ellen Call Long is buried next to her father in the family cemetery at the Grove. And the one thing that really makes me kind of sad is how small her tombstone is. I mean, if you blink, you will miss her tombstone. It's really little. I think she deserves a bigger tombstone, a more complex and complicated one for the kind of life that she led. But at least I'm happy to know that if you've watched this, now you maybe know more about Ellen Call Long, or maybe you've heard of her for the first time, and her very interesting, very complicated life. Thank you for being with me today. If you have any questions, just write to me at Wofford College. Bye-bye.